Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on al-Arabiya English. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme, Israel says it's preparing to reopen the Rafah crossing between Egypt and Gaza, but sets no clear date. This as Israel and Hamas continue to trade blame over violations of the US-mediated ceasefire. We'll get a US perspective on the peace efforts. Plus, coming up to a year since Bashar al-Assad was toppled, Syria's new leader, Ahmed al-Sharaa, pays a visit to Russia, where Assad now lives in exile. We find out how ties are shaping up between Moscow and Damascus, and we'll also assess the health of the Syrian economy. All of that to come. Hello and welcome to the programme. Plenty of developments today on the Gaza ceasefire, notably regarding the exchange of hostages and Palestinian detainees. At a Remembrance Day ceremony, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vowed to bring back every single one of the deceased hostages. Well, Israel says only 9 of the 28 deceased hostages' bodies have been returned, and that they are therefore now limiting aid into Gaza. Well, Hamas says it's handed over all the bodies it can find, but that it needs more time and equipment to locate the rest. Well, experts say that finding bodies in Gaza is no easy task, given the amount of rubble and destruction. And the US President Donald Trump appears to agree, downplaying claims that Hamas is violating the ceasefire deal by not returning all the dead hostages.
Well, they're looking for them, absolutely. They're looking. So we have the living hostages all back. They returned some more today. It's a gruesome process. I almost hate to talk about it. But they're digging. They're actually digging. There are areas where they're digging and they're finding a lot of bodies. Then they have to separate the bodies. You wouldn't believe this. And some of those bodies have been in there a long time. And some of them are under rubble. They have to remove rubble. But there are graves, and some are in tunnels that died in tunnels that are way down under the earth. And the tunnels are like 3 feet. Can you believe it? 3 feet high. They lived like this for a long period of time.
Well, we're joined now by Robert Fox, the defence editor for the London Evening Standard. Mr. Fox, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Always a pleasure talking to you. We've had about a week now to assess phase 1 of President Trump's 20-point peace plan. All things considered, how would you rate the implementation and the efficacy of this phase of the plan so far?
Well, some things have gone quite well. The return of the live hostages, and then some aid going in. And then some things have proved quite difficult, and one could see that they were going to be difficult from the first. And that is primarily stabilization in Gaza itself, and the future role, if any at all, of Hamas.
Right. I mean, it's obviously early days. I mean, looking forward, though, what sort of longer-term concerns do you have about this deal and where things might head to?
Hamas and the attitude of Netanyahu and Trump to Hamas and the principal Arab states. Because as the days go on, and this was predictable, that this is going to be a difficulty. And then we tend to forget that we've got 2.1 to 2.2 million Gazans who are bereft. They have got very, very little in a very difficult part of territory, one of the most overcrowded pieces of real estate on planet Earth. And they've got so little. And really, how can you build them up? How can you stabilize them? That's what it means: give them food, water, shelter, medicine, and a lot more. But also that how could you give them some kind of individual and collective trauma recovery? And we haven't even got anywhere near that. Also, I'm very critical always. You have to turn a critical eye to where Israel is going. Israel was pushed into this very intelligently, actually, by Donald Trump. He seized the opportunity of the attack on Doha on the 9th of September and said, look, we can't go on like this, and managed to persuade Netanyahu to go along with this. But there's such great reluctance, there's such a lack of confidence. This is a work in progress. And there's an awful lot of detailed work that still remains to be done. It always was going to be like that. But I wonder how much main effort there is going to be. Primarily, one of the things, of course, is how can you get a stabilization force there? They've talked about it over and over again, but there's no sign of that stabilization force. And so, meanwhile, Hamas is resurgent. They've got their fighters back on the street, and they're settling accounts with their rivals of different clans and gangs to ensure that they remain there.
Right.
Just to add to that, the pledge in the 20-point plan that Hamas decommissions and even steps away from taking control of future government in Gaza, that's looking very remote now.
Yeah, I mean, these public displays of force by Hamas in the form of these gruesome public executions that have been taking place in Gaza in the last few days. I mean, a suggestion, not only has Hamas made a bit of a comeback, but that they don't really plan on going anywhere. Do you think that's the message behind that?
That's the message behind it, but I think they were there all the time. And I think this was the problem, that for all the victory talk of Netanyahu, it's that Hamas, sufficient amount of Hamas, held the ground. And they held the ground, and rather just to be a bit cute about it, they held the underground, that they held a lot of defenses that Israel was finding, the Israeli IDF rather, were finding very hard to penetrate. And it's an absolute labyrinth and extremely complex, particularly as so much has been destroyed, which indeed is what they're finding in trying to recover what remains of the poor hostages that died there. Now, it's extremely complicated, and the problem is, such as the state of Israeli politics as well, I don't see any meeting of minds yet. There is nothing like the sort of Perez, Rabin, Arafat meetings that came in and around and up to the Oslo Accords, 93 to 94. And it really needs some sort of effort like that. And it's very, very interesting that an American president has done this. The people who are getting left out of all of this calculation is the people. What is the fate of these 2.1 plus million? They're now all refugees, with 90% of the fabric of Gaza destroyed. And you can't just wish them away by force or by divine action, which is what the hard right in Israel seem to want. And it was always going to be like this. After the euphoria, you come to the hard questions.
Right, you seem to be echoing what some of the other analysts we've spoken to have said, which is that in some strange way, the easy part is what's been achieved so far, and the much harder part is really what lies ahead.
Yes. And I think that this is where there has to be a concerted effort by the Arab allies. I think in actually talking them through to get them to, first of all, to Egypt, to Cairo, and then to Sharm el-Sheikh, I think that some very neat footwork was done. And I suspect it was largely the intelligence of Jared Kushner that had a lot to do there, because he knew a lot of the principal players. He said, look, the opportunity seems to have come along. We can't go on with this continuous cycle of killing. It's very much a Trump theme, by the way, because for all the belligerence of the conversation, and, you know, we'll beat the crap out of them, was the latest thing he said about Hamas if they don't comply from Trump. Trump doesn't really believe it. He doesn't believe in perpetual violence. And interestingly, there's a very interesting part to his statesmanship where Trump actually sees war as a last resort and not a first resort. And I think we should remind ourselves of that. And that's why, you know, he's gone back to America. He's really pushing that this thing will continue, but leaving to the principals in the region to make it work, when he's very serious about getting Putin to talk instead of being relentlessly committed to war. And I think that's also a great leverage for the Arab powers, the Arab alliance, because he doesn't like that in Netanyahu either. There's so much hanging in the air. We follow this through day by day, week by week, with a change in complexion. But It's who rules, who can guarantee stabilization in Gaza. It's the thing that's really going to count. And that is unclear at the moment.
When do you think we're going to see these leaders taking up their positions in this board that's going to oversee Gaza? I mean, a board overseen by President Trump, but will also have the former British Prime Minister Tony Blair as a key part of it. When do you think that gets sort of wheeled out?
I don't think it's going to be wheeled out in the form as described in the original document. It's too remote. It's too above. You need a board of control. You need people, local constituents with a local stake in the future of Gaza. And I don't think that Tony Blair would be acceptable to enough of the Gazan population that really has to do the business of implementation. You've got to empower what you can make of what you have got there. Can I put it like that? That was a terrible mistake, and it's a mistake that Blair was complicit in with George W. Bush in Iraq after the incursion of 2003, where they thought that they would de-Ba'athify, as it were, get rid of the Ba'ath Party and everything that attached to it, principally the administration, the whole teaching community, that's the administrative, public functionary, public servant class, and the army. It was simply a recipe for anarchy, as it so became, and it's a sort of playbook out of some sort of fantasy novel like Alice in Wonderland. To think that you can't. I think also there's an age thing. I mean, it's all very well and fine for me to talk about the age thing, but Blair has been around for too long. He shouldn't be coming back in here. Too many questions about the record. I mean, I find that very strange, and they've got to have some local empowerment. By the way, can I add to this something that I found very worrying in the Balkans, that they're going to bring successful, or Trump's team is proposing bringing in successful expats, people from the region who got out and then will come back in and use their expertise from banking and administration, whatever, anywhere in the world, including Europe and above all America. In my experience, having looked at it in the Balkans, having looked at it in Lebanon, the Middle East, and so on, and countries like Greece, bringing back the exiles or bringing back the self-exiles or bringing back the expat very rarely works. You've got to be a peculiar kind of genius, and you have to be a peculiar kind of genius that is still very much in touch with the community you're going to administrate and benefit. And so this is really a difficult one. It's how to generate skill and talent actually in the region as to what you've got. And one must salute in this the resilience of a lot of the Palestinian people. I mean, I'm still astonished with all the bans on international reporting, and organizations like the BBC on the whole have done very well in empowering local journalists. And as you know from where you are, a lot of the local journalists have been, quite a number, far too many, have been killed in Gaza. There is an intelligentsia there. There are people whose goodwill has to be galvanized. It can't be imposed from outside. And that's what worries me about the whole Trump concept.
So just before we wrap up, I mean, to go back to where we started, I mean, looking at where we are now and this issue of the deceased hostages' bodies not being returned, I mean, do you think this is the sort of thing that President Trump is going to do everything he can to avoid derailing his whole plan? Because I mean, can he really allow the ceasefire plan to be derailed by this issue of the hostages' bodies?
No, he won't allow it to be derailed by that. But the point that we really have to look at, if you look at the opinion polls involved here, particularly with the Israeli population, they're not keen. They've suffered 2 years from the hostage crisis. It's very interesting. Look at the reception that Witkoff got on the eve of the release of the deadline coming up in Hostage Square in Tel Aviv. And they said, yeah, he called for a shout out for President Trump. That went down very well. But the shout out with a very large crowd for Benjamin Netanyahu did not go at all well. And we know there's a lot of middle opinion. And I think that Netanyahu must be aware of it, particularly it puts him in a tight timetable, a tight schedule jam, as he faces election by this time next year. He must have had it by then, unless he does something quite extraordinary, which emergency laws, an emergency powers, which would lead to almost a martial law. I think that, again, that's the point that I say. The people are very interesting, and they're not as unanimous on this as we may have been led to think.
I mean, you're making it sound like Benjamin Netanyahu is actually one of the principal obstacles to what President Trump wants to achieve here, which is not just this 20-point plan and implementing that and drawing a line under this conflict, but broadening the Abraham Accords, which is a big part of what he hopes will be, a big part of the legacy of his second term in office. I mean, is that what you're saying, that Netanyahu is ultimately the main obstacle?
But no, what I'm saying is that, yes, the Abraham Accords do feature in this, and this is why we have the role of Jared Kushner here. But the rhetoric and often posture of Netanyahu is very difficult for Trump. But it was exploiting that in saying, you have got to stop, when he tried to kill al-Hayat with that strike in Doha on the 9th of September. Now, that's the sort of thing he will not countenance. And Netanyahu right away was starting to say, oh, the war isn't over, when Trump was saying it is over, and that, that Hamas must be destroyed. We have things to do. I think there are a lot of his people, including quite a few people in the Israeli Defense Forces, do not want this perpetual war. It's the great weakness of this kind of approach, the most belligerent approach of belligerent Israelis. It's always with its nose down into the tactics of the thing, and the strategic vision is very, very difficult to see. And this is the real weakness. Is Netanyahu going to break with the conservative right of the settler bloc, as it were, the likes of Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, and Strzok, or is he going to try and steer a middle course? But I suspect that the net result of this, despite Trump's efforts, which are rather extraordinary, to get the slate wiped and the three charges against him, for which Netanyahu is now standing trial, trying to get them dropped, that won't work. I do think it's very strange because he's been around for so long. I do think that we're in the last year or so of Netanyahu in power, whatever happens in the election next year.
OK, well, we appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Thank you very much indeed. We're out of time. Robert Fox, defence editor of the London Evening Standard. Thank you for your time, sir.
Thank you.
We can speak now to William Lawrence, who's a former senior US diplomat who lived and worked for 15 years in 7 different countries across the Middle East and North Africa. He joins us from Washington. Specifically, William, you join us from the National Press Club. I'll talk to you about that a bit as the interview goes on, but I want to start by just asking you, I mean, we've hit a slight, roadblock here, a bump in the road. Hamas has returned all 20 of the living hostages and 9 out of the 28 deceased hostages. And of course, Israel is threatening Hamas with more consequences for not returning all of them. But President Trump is sounding a little bit more lenient on this issue than Israel. What are your thoughts?
When Trump is sounding lenient, it's because certain advisors are talking to him and other advisors are not. As you know, Trump is highly unpredictable, and what he's saying often reflects the last conversation he had. It's clear that he wants the peace deal to go forward. He's highly aware that Netanyahu and his allies are going to try to torpedo the deal and will be looking for pretexts. But on the other hand, it remains to be seen how hard Trump is willing to press the Israelis to keep up their end of the deal. We already saw in the 5 of the 20 points that were in the 6-point plan signed last Thursday between Israel and Hamas, that there were ways the 5 efforts could fall apart, including this part about the deceased hostages, even though all Hamas had to do under the agreement was notify Israel about its difficulties and continue to look for the deceased hostages. Some of them are buried. Some of them were held by other organizations. Some of them were killed by Israeli airstrikes and are under the rubble and impossible to recover, which is one of the reasons why Hamas said they need special equipment to go looking for and to recover some of the bodies. But what the most right-wing Israeli government in Israeli history is looking to do is find pretexts to sort of unravel the deal as much as possible. So they've already cut the agreed upon humanitarian assistance by half, and they say they're going to cut it more. They're already saying that if Hamas doesn't lay down its weapons, the ceasefire is over, which is not true, because that's supposed to be a phased laying down along with the phased Israeli withdrawal, and it's supposed to be over time and negotiated. So that's not being respected. And then, of course, on the bodies, they're looking for pretexts as well, in part because it's such a hot button issue for the Israeli population, which is now 70% against the Gaza war. So Trump has many incentives to be lenient. Whether he's lenient in one moment to another depends often on, who he's been talking to. But so far, it seems like Trump is doing what he needs to try to keep his peace plan on track.
Right. So he's not going to allow this issue, you don't think, to derail the deal altogether?
Yeah, I don't think he's going to do that. If I can make one other point that we were just talking about here, it was misreported in the entire press what was signed on Monday in Cairo. It was not the 20-point plan. It was not the 6-point deal that Israel and Hamas signed. It was simply an 8-paragraph declaration, Trump declaration by the White House, just saying that, Trump's doing everything right. And it said 20 leaders signed it. There were 25 heads of state and heads of government there, but only 4 signed it. And so what that reinforces is the notion that none of this really has the weight of international law behind it. None of it is really agreements that a lot of people have agreed to. What it is a Trump-driven process, which is why your first question is so important. And whether it stays on track will be if Trump himself and his team decide to drive it to remain on track.
Right. I mean, we might find ourselves in the rather curious situation in which the United States and other countries are helping Hamas to try to locate the remains of those 19 deceased hostages. I mean, that would be quite an extraordinary development, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and that raises another issue, which I think hasn't been discussed enough, that there isn't one Hamas, there's many Hamases. One way to think of it is there's Hamas, the fighters, there's Hamas, the government, including the negotiating team, and there's Hamas, the technocrats, like the health ministry and the education infrastructure, many of whom will have to be, even though we think Hamas is going to lay down its weapons and leave the country, the cadres of Gaza are Hamas, they're under Hamas now. So we're going to have to sort of have a more complex understanding of what Hamas is and what Hamas will transform into. And part of it is just all the best engineers and technical people in Gaza who have decades of experience working with international organizations, the UN, the US, USAID, which isn't there anymore, but it's been folded into the State Department and will be involved in, the reconstruction of Gaza and the rebuilding of the hospitals and the universities and everything that was destroyed. And, these are just, regular Gazans with degrees who are sort of Hamas, but not in the sense that we think of the fighting force. And there will be a lot of international cooperative teams made available who can help with not only locating the bodies, but the multi-year, maybe multi-decade process of removing all the rubble and all the toxic war debris that would make Gaza life impossible, and that's a huge project.
Right, and anyone who's seen pictures of Gaza will be well aware of the amount of rubble we're talking about. Huge quantities of rubble, massive destruction. And then you've got the Israeli Defense Minister, Israel Katz, saying we'll resume fighting and presumably bombardment as well if Hamas does not honor the terms of the agreement and hand over those bodies. But I mean, it stands to reason, doesn't it, that if bombardment of Gaza continues, finding those 19 missing, deceased hostages is going to be made even more difficult.
Absolutely. And let me raise one other point. Very good international organizations estimate that the total number of deceased in Gaza may be as high as 180,000. Officially, we have 67,000 killed and I believe 17 or 19,000 missing. That means there's probably 17 or 19,000 Gazans under the rubble, and it could be a lot more, according to some of those estimates. And the same equipment that would be used to find the, what's the number now, 20 deceased Israeli hostages could be used to locate the thousands and maybe tens of thousands of Palestinians under the rubble, which should be part of any operation to rebuild Gaza. I mean, I think it would be even more cruel than the cruelty we've seen for 2 years to start building on top of deceased Gazans. So that's a whole nother operation I haven't really seen discussed yet.
One development we've been talking about a bit on this channel the last few days is that Hamas has been making a bit of a show of force on the ground in Gaza. There have been reports of public executions being carried out, presumably to send out a message. I don't know what you think that message is and whether you think it looks like Hamas is on track to disarm as per that 20-point plan.
I think Hamas doesn't want to disarm just as much as Israel doesn't want to pull back to the lines that were in the maps of Gaza that we saw with Israel pulling back. And so that's going to have to be forced through by the Trump administration. And it would have to be phased, which is why all the negotiations around phase 2 of the peace deal were broke down over the last 2 years. And none of that's been really flushed out in these 15 points now. And it remains to be seen, what that phasing would look like and who takes over. But in terms of the score settling, Hamas is going after the people that worked with the Israeli forces who are also involved in various types of criminality during the conflict and before. These are sort of the opponents of Hamas, but these are not saints. These are criminal gangs and those that worked with the Israeli occupation in ways that were antithetical to a lot of what loyal Palestinians would consider honorable. And so while Hamas should be performing summary executions in the streets of Gaza, they are going to be the power in Gaza until the international stabilization force is formed and deployed, which could take weeks or months or even over a year. So Hamas is now the ruling authority in Gaza. And then what Hamas becomes is a very complex negotiation. The sort of best case scenario is some of the senior leadership leaves Gaza under the deal. Others disarm and become part of a Palestinian security force, either under the PA or under some new formulation. And then all these technocrats will still be there. It just won't be called Hamas anymore. And that's part of the longer negotiation that hasn't happened yet.
The 20-point plan makes some provision and mentions a future Palestinian state, or at least a pathway towards a future Palestinian state. And that is, of course, one of the main demands of many of America's Middle East allies. That is something they want to see happen. How does President Trump reconcile those factors with what appears to be Israel's more or less utter rejection of this notion of a future Palestinian state?
Without saying it, I think most of the foreign policy establishment in Washington, whether around Trump or anti-Trump, believes this will never happen while Netanyahu and this government's in power. But there's a significant chance that Netanyahu doesn't win the elections in 2026. and there's a significant chance he gets forced out by some other means. And so it would be probably a more centrist, maybe national unity Israeli government that could revert back to those Oslo goals and objectives, which would be two populations living side by side. I've looked at all the different proposals. I think 14 different proposals for one state and two state solutions, and there's really no way to do this if the ultimate Israeli state is going to be Jewish. If it's going to be secular and wonderful and utopian, that would be maybe the best outcome. But if it isn't, if it's going to be a Jewish state with a Jewish character, it's going to probably need to be some sort of two-state solution. So if the millions of Palestinians aren't ejected out of the country, which is what the far right in Israel wants, there's going to have to be sovereignty for that group. And now 80% of the UN members have recognized the Palestinian state. And even Trump quietly has said he'd be willing. And of course, most Arab and Muslim states are tying normalization with Israel to a clear pathway to a Palestinian state, which would come out of this process. So yeah, hope is not lost. I think a lot of foreign policy experts believe that as of Monday, the two-state solution is back in discussion in ways it hasn't been in a long time. Right.
So basically, without the pathway to a Palestinian state, and without that Palestinian state being ultimately achieved, there will be no expansion of the Abraham Accords, at least very little expansion, and certainly not from some of the key players here in the Middle East.
Yeah, and Saudi Arabia is leading the way. And what happened in Doha after the attack on Doha by Israel, which was the last straw for Trump and triggered his change of heart about ending the Gaza war from maybe by December to October, was then, you had this meeting in Doha of all the Arab and Muslim countries, more or less, agreeing that they're going to speak with one voice now. And I think that, as much as anything else, has created a situation in which normalization is basically stopped until the Palestinians have a clear pathway to a state. And frankly, also it's worth mentioning that Mahmoud Abbas's appearance last minute in Sharm el-Sheikh and the photo op with Trump was a direct affront to the Israelis, because they didn't want the PA recognized in any way in this process going forward. Fatah/Palestinian Authority /PA, and they shook hands with Trump, and they're seen as part of it. So that's a good sign for those that hope that we'll have a faster progress towards a Palestinian state in the coming years.
And just lastly, I said I would ask you about the fact that you're at the National Press Club there in Washington today. Just tell us what's happening there. What's the conference taking place there all about?
So it's the annual conference of the Arab Center. I've actually spoken at this conference a couple of times before. I spoke on Trump's foreign policy at year one of the first Trump administration. This is almost entirely dedicated to Palestine and Gaza. There's a panel going on right now of all the top Palestine experts from the various U.S. universities and think tanks. Chaz Freeman, the former ambassador, just gave probably the most eloquent speech on Palestine I've ever heard at a U.S. conference. There's a huge round of applause. I think their biggest attendance ever. Mehdi Hassan's getting an award this afternoon. It's really a coming together of all the people who used to be a tiny minority of Americans who advocated for Palestine and now represent the majority of Americans. They're all here next door talking about sort of what's wrong with what's going on now and what needs to change moving forward to help the Palestinians and the Israelis have a better political, economic, and legal future with justice and social justice. I mean, there's just many mountains to climb when it comes to reconstructing Gaza, and when it comes to building a Palestinian state, rebuilding, and also stopping Israel from attacking its neighbors. I think 7 of its neighbors, or 8 now, have been attacked in the context of this 2-year conflict, and that needs to stop. And that was actually the beginning of the discussion today, was how much the U.S. has gone from simply enabling Israel to participating in Israel's attacks, and how that needs to stop.
Okay, well, we appreciate you sharing that with us. Thank you very much indeed. A pleasure talking to you. William Lawrence, former senior US diplomat. Thank you for your time, sir.
Pleasure.
Well, it is Thursday, which means it's time now for our weekly US segment, where we look back at some of the top stories making the headlines in the United States this week. We're joined by Republican strategist and lawyer Amanda Makki, who is a friend of the show. Amanda, welcome back. Always a pleasure seeing you. We were just talking there about the efforts to bring peace and stability to Gaza and the broader region. How much of a top story has all of this been in the United States? And are people giving plenty of credit to President Trump for his efforts?
Well, it was interesting because it came at the same time as the nomination of the Nobel Peace Prize. And so a lot of people had suspected, certainly President Trump suspected, that he would be the nominee. And unfortunately, that didn't happen for the president. And so it did become a story. So the story, I would say, it almost cascaded, one, with obviously the historic signing of this peace agreement. And then you had, the story of President Trump making this whirlwind trip to the Middle East and back within like 48 hours. And then, of course, he made news talking about, well, we're going to do Ukraine and Russia next, and then we got to look at peace in Iran. And so then that became a story unto itself. So you had a lot of cascading of this story, I would say. But really, this has all been in the backdrop of a government shutdown that has now gone into its 15th day. And so that's really where Americans are more concerned about the home front. What's happening here when we go to the airports? Are we safe with the agents who are checking our bags? Are we safe with those who are keeping the skies clear? So those are the things that people worry about. And then, of course, putting food on the table and these government assistance programs that may not be there. And then on top of that, you have the administration giving RIF notices, which are basically, we're taking away your jobs here in the federal government because it no longer aligns with our policies, it's duplicative, and it's no longer needed. So yes, it's a big story, but in the backdrop, unfortunately, right now, of a government shutdown that has shut the federal government down now for 15 days.
Yeah, Amanda, you raised some really important points there, and we'll come back to some of them. Just on the subject of the Nobel Peace Prize, I mean, do I get the sense from you that you think that President Trump should have got it this time, or would you be in favor of him getting it maybe next year when, the dust has settled, so to speak, in Gaza?
Well, I do believe that he's done a lot more than just Gaza. I mean, what he's done with 8 wars that he has stopped and conflicts that he's stopped. I do understand that the dates and the parameters of the dates may be different. But in that vein, Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, has said that he is working with his counterpart in Israel in the Knesset, the Speaker of the Knesset, and others throughout the world, I'm sure, will be involved in really pushing next year to make sure that President Trump wins the Nobel Peace Prize. And really, if you can be objective, and I know a lot of people can't be objective because they have disdain for certain people, it really is truly remarkable what he's been able to achieve. I mean, we're talking about something that has gone on for centuries that really has evaded every president. If you look at presidents from the time of really Clinton, let's just start with George H.W. Bush, then Clinton, Obama, and following George Bush Jr., up to the present, really no one has been able to tackle that. And most importantly, look at Joe Biden. He was the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate. His expertise is foreign policy. I think this really comes down to how did a New York developer was able to do this along with other real estate developers. If you look at who Steve Witkoff is and Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, they were able to broker this, yet politicians who had been in public service for 4+ decades couldn't achieve that. And that's really the remarkable story here, is that it is a negotiation. At the end of the day, it is about the art of the deal, which is synonymous with President Trump.
To give them their dues, both Presidents Biden and Clinton did praise President Trump for what he's managed to achieve. I mean, that's unusual, isn't it, in this sort of polarized world? And
so President Clinton certainly did praise, and even Hillary Clinton, who was President Trump's opponent in 2016, in that very vicious race, I would say, she still gave praise. And if you remember, about a month and a half ago, she said, I will nominate him if he does get this done. And certainly he did. Where I would say President Biden and President Biden's former staff have gone is kind of the sour route, I would call it, sour grapes, where they're like, well, this all started with Joe Biden's platform and it was because of Joe Biden. I think you got to give credit where credit's due and be classy about it.
Okay, let's talk about the shutdown that you mentioned there. Any end in sight to that?
You know, I heard something yesterday that just really made me sad for our country, and it made me sad for all the federal workers, because I'm from the Washington, D.C. area, which is where the lion's share of federal employees are. I know how that town and the surrounding suburbs in Maryland, Virginia, how they are indexed to the federal government. And with a government shutdown now going into its second week, now you have employees that are not getting paid. They're not getting their paycheck. The way the shutdown worked, it fell on the first of the month, so they did get a paycheck the first day of the month, but now they've worked 2 weeks and they haven't gotten a paycheck. And there's really no end in sight as to when they will get a paycheck. So what you're going to start seeing is people are going to not be showing up to work, but really the morale is going to be so low because we don't know where things are headed. Yesterday, a member of Congress told his staff, you should look at getting a short-term loan because we could be a couple months into this. That is a very scary thought, because people's mortgages don't stop because there is a government shutdown. People's car notes don't stop because there's a government shutdown. Medical bills don't stop. Of course, that town will understand, and hopefully, you know, people will be graceful, but not that graceful. And that's a really difficult thing for people to not have their paychecks and not be able to pay their bills because of something that's completely out of their control.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like really tough on those federal employees. Let's talk about the ICE raids that have been happening across the United States. It's been reported that there's a state of emergency in Los Angeles now. I mean, are these raids having the desired effect, would you say?
I do think they are having a desired effect that the administration is seeking, and that they want people to go back. They certainly want people to not be coming to the United States who are coming here illegally from all parts of the world, not just Central America, not just South America, but all parts of the world. And so they have been able to really stop and block people at the border. We don't have a border crisis anymore. That was one of President Trump's platform agenda items that I think he can say, I checked the box on that. Certainly what we had under the Biden administration was unacceptable. Even people in the Biden administration will say so. But what is happening right now is that you're seeing the president take his federal troops into towns to do these ICE raids, and it is effective in that people know that if they do not have the proper documents, that they will be sent back. And what you see California doing is really thwarting what the federal government is aiming to do. That's illegal. So if they want to give rental assistance and legal assistance and collect funds from the law-abiding taxpayers of Los Angeles and give it to illegals, people who are here illegally, that is something that I think the people of Los Angeles are going to revolt over, because their tax dollars are now being being used to help people pay their rent that are non-documented illegal Americans. So I think that is something that you're seeing throughout the United States. It's happening. And I do believe that Democrats and Republicans and independents are in support of having a country of laws and law-abiding people living here, not illegals.
And just lastly, Amanda, before we let you go, there's another story making headlines around the world, and it relates to Venezuela, not for the first time, because President Trump has indicated in the last 24 hours or so that he authorized covert CIA action against an alleged drug boat in the Caribbean. Just tell us a bit more about what happened here.
Yeah, well, this is not the first. President Trump has been very serious about stopping the cartels from coming anywhere near the United States. But now he's taking extraordinary measures. And obviously what has happened, now this is the second time this has happened, you are going to be seeing what he has said is potentially land raids that could happen. So I think it's really interesting that he's using all methods available to him to stop the cartels from getting even close to the United States. He believes very strongly that those cartels have destroyed the United States and that their people in charge in Venezuela and Mexico, when he's dealt with Scheinbaum, that they're not doing enough to put pressure on their cartels to not taint the United States, to not kill more Americans with the fentanyl crisis and other drug crises that we've had over the past decade. So I think President Trump is just doing, again, what he promised he would do. He's taking measures that a lot of people are kind of taken aback by, but he believes these are in the best interest of keeping Americans safe and keeping the drugs out of the United States, because Venezuela's leadership won't do it.
And just briefly, if you will, I mean, does it look and sound to you like the US is seeking regime change in Venezuela?
I don't think President Trump's looking at regime change. And the reason I say that is because if he had wanted to do that, one, he is not a war hawk. He is our first Republican president that you've seen not start wars. He is not engaged in wars, initiated wars, and he certainly did not campaign on doing that. He did not campaign on regime change in a country like Iran when he certainly had the opportunity during that 14-day war in June. He certainly had the opportunity to do regime change, even if the people of Iran wanted to. He doesn't want to put American troops in harm's way of things that are not the responsibility of the United States. I don't believe that. I don't see that on the horizon, mainly because he is not a war hawk.
Okay, we appreciate that. Thank you very much indeed, Republican strategist and lawyer Amanda Makki. Thank you very much indeed for joining us this week.
Thank you.
Now, turning our attention to Syria, where economic reforms are starting to take shape. The finance ministry says it aims to boost the private sector and attract foreign investment moving forwards despite sanctions. Well, a new Syrian development fund is going to be put in place, which is going to finance reconstruction and infrastructure projects. Well, symbolically, the government plans a new banknote, which is going to drop the portraits of the former Syrian presidents Hafez and Bashar al-Assad. Well, here to discuss the Syrian economy with us now is Dr. Mahmoud Abdul Kareem, who's an economic and financial researcher. Thank you very much indeed for coming to see us. The Syrian Finance Minister Mohamed Yasser Barnier spoke to the IMF on Wednesday. What was his message to them, do you think?
First of all, thank you for having me. Actually, the message was like he announced it during the meeting that they're not there really just to to ask for a loan. They were really asking here just to the support of the IMF, the World Bank, to develop the infrastructure. Especially, I'm talking of the institutional infrastructure to improve, the confidence, the economic confidence, and also the institutional discipline as well. So what they're looking for, as a kind of a reforming of the whole, system and specifically I'm talking here right now in the physical, system. Actually, it is a really good, approach and really good move, just to approach the IMF on order just to obtain from them the expertise and the know-how and all this, and to also develop all the old way of dealing, with monies, with the, with the physical policy and monetary policy as well. So right now, what he just, I'm just quoting exactly from him. Right now, we're not really seeking any loan from the from the IMF or from the World Bank. So that potentially It gave you kind of, a signal that in the future, they might ask for that.
Okay.
The main reason for that, just actually to approach that, the IMF and the World Bank, okay, to develop, as I said, the whole system, also bring some confidence to the economic system, which will be reflected on, in the whole system, and bring more confidence to the investor that are willing to invest in Syria. Because the current system is fully corrupted system, and an old system, you cannot rely on that system.
Okay.
Okay, you cannot just secure, you cannot just, because you cannot secure your money if you want to just invest your money, invest and put any money in investment there.
Okay, so you made a lot of important points there. I mean, clearly rebuilding the economy
Yeah.
and carrying out some important reforms is really the priority. And when it comes to rebuilding, we're talking about a reconstruction cost of tens of billions of US dollars. And I want to know where you think that money is going to come from if it doesn't come from the IMF and the World Bank.
Okay, mainly, the way how, the government is doing just to, to raise the fund in order to rebuild the infrastructure physically is using the PPP, which is the public and private partnership, public and private partnership, in the form of BOT, okay? So, for many reasons, okay, for two reasons, because the government itself cannot finance it. There is no resources to finance that huge, amount of money to rebuild the whole reconstructions. So, as the Mr. President Ahmed al-Sharaa announced in his, latest, interview, he mentions explicitly that, okay, the amount or how much it will cost to rebuild the whole, okay, Syria, okay, or reconstruction or rebuild the Syria, roughly between $60 billion to $900 billion. So it's impossible to, rely on the internal resources. You have to rely on that one from, creating a fund, from neighbors, from Saudi Arabia, from other country like Qatar, UAE, Oman, all these countries which would contribute and add some money for rebuilding the infrastructure, because the infrastructure is a core sector for all other sectors. Without infrastructure, rebuilding the infrastructure, okay, you cannot have any other sector, okay, and you cannot just attract any investor to invest. Let's say, let's take an example in tourism, industry, for instance. At the same time, focusing on the infrastructure is very critical. Okay, for two reasons. First of all, it's because it's a labor-intensive sector, in the sense that it requires more labor than any other sector. For instance, we have a really equation in economy. We say for every $1 million, okay, this will cause about 6 to 9 laborers to work on that industry. This is a direct labor, and there's an indirect labor, roughly about 100 to 200 indirect labor. So this is the two reasons. That's why Saudi Arabia focus directly to the infrastructure sector, the structure that in rebuilding this, because Saudi Arabia, from my opinion, okay, they care more about the Syrian people. Okay, that's the reason why they always, okay, push all the investors, all the businessmen to go and invest more in the infrastructure rather than any other industry. Okay, because they want just to help Syria to go back to the normal life, and also to the Syrian people.
And when it comes to the Syrian people, I mean, what is the daily reality like right now? It's been, 10 months since Bashar al-Assad left the country. In terms of prices, salaries, purchasing power, what are you hearing? What is daily life like now for a Syrian person?
It's really, they're really suffering. So just to be honest.
Have things got better?
They're really suffering from currently right now. I mean, they suffered worse before, but now they're still suffering. Even after the increase in the public sector salary, which is 200%, still the purchasing power of the Syrian pound considers very weak comparatively with the good price. So because of the fluctuations of the exchange rate, first. Second, the loss of confidence of the Syrian pound as well. because most of the people right now relying on the dollarizations. So mainly now any exchange happening in dollar. They don't have any trust in the Syrian pound. This is one of the things. Now, the government should have a really strict control in pricing goods and services whenever they just increase, like whenever doing any incremental on salaries, okay, or whatever. Otherwise, that will be reflected in goods and service, and nothing will happen. So again, still, you can just consider, as per the official, by the official statement by the UNDP, okay, more than 50% of the population live below the poverty line. So that's really very figures that you can think about it, how people, they are really suffering.
Sure.
Apart from that, you can see like 70% of the people, they are unemployed, especially the youth people. Okay, so again, we need these, okay, like all these projects that already announced to take place. So most of the projects that they already announced it, they're still under the status of MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, because sanction not lifted, okay, on paper, yes, are lifted, but it didn't take any, we didn't see any reflection of lifting the sanction till the moment.
Okay.
Even transaction through SWIFT right now. So like I approached one of the bank, one of the European country, trying just to send money to Syria. They say, okay, we don't accept that. They have this fear of something called the secondary sanction. The secondary sanction, because secondary sanction, if you deal with any country that were or under sanction, they might be subject to be under secondary sanction, and they impose on them something called secondary sanction. Okay? So again, the reform should be focused on the people more than anything else.
I want to ask you, because we haven't got much time left, the Syrian president, Ahmed al-Sharaa, was in Moscow on Wednesday, holding talks with the president there. And of course, Russia, just to remind our viewers, was a key ally and key supporter of the previous president of Russia, of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, who now ironically lives in Moscow, not far from where those talks were taking place. Yeah. What was the point of those talks, and where do you see Russia and Syria's relationship, particularly its economic relationship, going to from here?
Okay, actually, if you know Syria been been in ally relationship from the 1940s, like before the Assad father came to the power. Okay, so what I'm trying, so mostly all the, let's say, if you go just to the infrastructure, okay, was built by the Russian, okay, by the Soviet Union initially. Power, okay, even oil, extraction of oil, all these kind of, the infrastructure, okay, were actually built using the Soviet Union, okay, labor, also, tools. So even the military itself. So if you want to just get rid of all the military, which are all the Russian, made, okay, you need like a lot of money. So it's better just to approach Russia, rebuild the relationship, try to kind of renegotiate, for instance, all the agreement that have been signed with the previous President Bashar al-Assad. Okay, at least especially for the two military, base, the one in the, in Tartus, the naval one, and the other one in Hmeimim, another one. So this is really, I think that's a very important, approach to renegotiate, not closed, okay, for any other people. Because, okay, Russia was, as you mentioned, was an ally, support Bashar al-Assad to stay in power for certain years. But at the same time, okay, we cannot ignore the big contribution in the infrastructure and the economy of the Syria, as well as in the military.
Okay.
So that's the main reason for that, that visit.
Okay, and just lastly and briefly, I mean, we were saying that Bashar al-Assad now lives in Moscow. Do you see a day when perhaps he could become a bargaining chip and perhaps he'll be handed over to the Syrians and face trial? Is that something you can envisage?
That would be my day. I wish that would happen, actually. I don't think so. No, no, I don't think that will do that. It will ruin the reputation of the Moscow. Even in addition to that, Moscow is not part of that, agreement. They call Rome. I forget what's
Rome
the
Treaty.
Yeah, exactly. So it was kind of, they can just, give Bashar al-Assad for trial or something. That I don't think that would happen. But they might go into negotiation for all the money that he stole. Okay, from the government, which roughly the estimating is almost $200 billion.
Okay, so that will go a long way towards reconstructing Syria.
Yeah, it will support that one.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time, but really appreciate you coming to see us. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Mahmoud Abdul Kareem. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, that's all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us tomorrow for a look back at some of the best interviews of the week. Until then, bye-bye.